education and the theory and practice of institutional research. I've got to know you in your supervision portfolio that you teach the students and lectures how to be supervisions, and I know that you're passionate about this topic that you're talking about. So thank you so much for being here and giving us a bit of your world. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marlene. Good morning, colleagues. It's good to see so many people here. Welcome at the Library Week. I know it's very important for our colleagues in the library to have so many people attending here. And I look forward to spend an hour with you. Fortunately, this talk will be followed by a much more experienced presenter. And I'm honored that Professor Rawlings is here. We've worked together for many years at this institution, so we've agreed that I will talk first and then he will do all the corrections afterwards. I will cover those topics, the PhD as a qualification, talk a little bit about the broad things around that, the difference between a master's and a PhD, and then this notion of doctorateness. And I'm teased by my students often. They say I'm Mr. Doctorateness. So I use the concept quite often, and people find it helpful. And then those two issues of what is theory and where do you find the theories, and what is it, because you have to make a theoretical contribution if you write the thesis. And what is a contribution and what is original? Many doctoral students struggle with that. Now, I've had a quick glance at the list, and I gather that the majority of people in the room are either postdocs or PhDs, or people say emerging researchers, and there are also a number of experienced researchers. So bear with me, I'll try to sort of cover the interests of a broader range, and I'll give some time for discussion. Hopefully we'll have time. I won't talk for the full hour. All right. You wouldn't believe it, but the field of doctoral supervision is a field of scholarly investigation. So there are actually people doing research in this field. There are not only practitioners like you doing it, there are many people like me researching the phenomenon of doctoral supervision. And I'll cover some of those writings, and there are journals, and there are conferences, all the academic stuff goes on in that area. Okay. In addition to be called Mr. Doctorateness, I love to be called Mr. Big Picture. And that's where I want to begin. The European research landscape, they have identified these 6, what they call grand challenges. And there's a whole lot of theorizing around these challenges. And one of the tricky things is that you don't necessarily know where you want to get when you engage with these challenges. The outcome or the achievement is not clear because the problems are so complex and they're mostly interdisciplinary. So that's the place to begin. If you think about a doctoral degree, it's really big picture. Issues that confront humanity all across the planet and beyond. And there you have the list, and you can look at that. So that's, I think, a first thing to do if you do your PhD is, although you work very specifically in your field of study, think about these bigger picture. And this is just one such a list. There are many others. You can look at the research priorities identified by the NRF or in other parts of the world, and make sure that you see yourself fitting with your research in that big picture. I think it's very important. That image is always used, that the people who built the cathedral in Cologne in Germany way back in the 12th century, the person who was the masonry wasn't aware what's going to happen with this little stone that I was working on, and it ended up being a cathedral. So when you work in the detail of your discipline, remember that little piece that you will contribute to the body of knowledge will in the end contribute to the cathedral, which is beautiful and majestic and the big picture. So here is the big picture thing with an image. There you are as a researcher, you look at a specific problem, the little circle there, and let me just get this thing going. Do I have a pointer? No. I should have checked that before. Huh?
Sorry.
Is there a pointer?
Yeah, the top, the red one.
The red one.
Yes.
Good. Okay, I can't talk if I don't do that. A former vice rector at our university, Professor Henny Rousseau, he wrote a very interesting piece on what he called the bifocal nature of the work at a university. You look at an immediate problem, but you don't stop there. You look beyond the immediate problem to the bigger picture. And you want to find solutions and explanations in the big world out there that explains your specific problem. And you theorize about what you see if you look beyond the specific problem. Now, let's say the specific problem is a mosquito. I taught this course recently in one of our neighboring countries where they have malaria, and there was a mosquito. We sat in the pub one night at about 7 o'clock after lectures, and there was a mosquito around, and I was quite afraid. I said, oh, I need to watch out here for that mosquito. And my colleague who was sitting there from the local university said, no, don't worry. These mosquitoes, the ones that fly around 8 o'clock in the evening, the early ones, they're not infected, so you're okay. Watch out after 11, then you have a problem, but this one is fine. And then another one said, remember, it's only the females, huh? So just check whether it's a female. If it's not a female, you're okay. And another one said, but you know what we do to counter this malaria and all of that, you need to put a fan in your room. And the sort of the movement of the air in your room, that will take care of the mosquito, and you will be safe, you can sleep peaceful. So these are all theories. So we have one specific mosquito, and we have various theories explaining how to deal with this mosquito. Now, I'm sure the experts in the room will have much, much better explanations than this one. But I use this as an example. We can take many others where we have our specific problem, and when we do a PhD, we need to realize that you can't get stuck in a small, very defined specific problem. You have to see through that in a bifocal manner, look at the big picture, and see how that fit in the big picture. Now, I'm not saying big picture doesn't mean you need to be all over the place. You need to focus. But through the focus, you look beyond. You're not focusing, and it's not the end of your vision. So what do you see when you see the big picture? Let's make that a little bit more complex. You've seen that many times, or that type of thing. Is it a hare, a duck, or a rabbit? So you need to look at it for a while and then figure out, now, what is it? Is it both? How do you decide what is it, what you see out there? Look at it more clearly. And there's all kinds of theorizing around that where you have phenomena out there, and depending on your frame of reference, your presuppositions, your way of observing the phenomenon, whether it's a physical phenomenon or whether it's a social phenomenon, whatever field of studies you are in, you are not necessarily seeing only clearly defined simplistic things out there. Reality is complex. And that is the whole challenge in academic work, to deal with this type of complexity. It's the same thing, but there are at least two things there, and there may be more. So that shows you the complexity, and also the humility that goes with academic work. You do all the work, you spend 3, 4, 5 years on your PhD, you make a contribution, and then, well, you know very well how little you know, but sometimes you're also proud. You think, I've made a real contribution, and this is the truth. This is that thing. And there I want to urge us to remember that the results, our findings, are always provisional. It's always an explanation in terms of a specific set of presuppositions and work that we did. It's not necessarily the final truth that we put out there. Okay, that's a few comments about what is a PhD about. It's a big picture thing, focused. You look through a specific problem to the broader field of problems, and what you will see out there will be complex. And from that, we need to try to make sense in our PhD. Okay, a few words about what is a PhD in a more formal sense. Now, as good academics, you don't necessarily know that, and you don't work with that every day, mercifully, but there are people who work with the bureaucracy, the machinery of the higher education system and the university system. And there's a thing called the Higher Education Qualifications Sub-Framework, where they define what is a PhD, what is a professional PhD, what is a master's degree, and all kinds of bureaucratic requirements. How should it be named and all of that. But the important thing I want to show you is in this high-level government policy, it says the purpose of a PhD is to train academics for an academic career, high-level research capability, and to make a significant and original contribution, and there's no coursework in a South African PhD. There is a possibility also for a professional PhD, where there is a research component of 60% and the other 40% can be in the form of coursework. Now, government hasn't sorted that out. It's not clear whether people offering such a professional degree would get the same funding. So the universities are reluctant to go there. The majority, I would say, 99% of PhDs in the country are still this one, where the only credit that you get is for the thesis. Sometimes in our department we require coursework also, but you don't credit for it. You don't get credit, you have to complete it before you can submit your thesis, but it's not credit bearing. And then of course the masters, the high level definition, is to train researchers who can contribute to the development of knowledge in a particular area. So to mastering that, the skills and the capabilities to do research in that field. So that is the high-level bureaucratic definition. There's a problem with that in the sense that PhDs increasingly are not ending up working in universities. We don't do universities, PhDs nowadays to become professors. Some do, but quite a large number, and more, larger numbers across the world, do not end up working in universities. There are simply not enough university positions available, and with the knowledge economy and the way the world works nowadays, more and more PhDs, you need this high-level, developed, talented people, and the talentism becomes the sort of the oil of the new knowledge economy in whatever field you work. There's another bureaucratic body in South Africa, the Qualifications Authority, and they've worked out a very detailed scheme on explaining the difference between a master's and a PhD. And I won't bore you with that. You can go to the website and look at that. But these are the things that the higher education system, the universities, sort of behind the scenes in the machine room, that people use to make sure that we pitch our PhDs at the right level. And examiners and supervisors have to take into account these type of things. But let me bring it closer, more specifically closer home to what we do in our academic work. How do we explain the difference between a master's and a PhD? We can take the broad definition and say that the thesis is mastering the craft of that of scholarship and science in that field. So you can do research. You must demonstrate that you can do research. And in the PhD, you must actually do it, and you must make a contribution. And I will talk about that. What is a contribution in the context of this big picture theorizing world in which we live? The implications of making a contribution is novelty, originality, coverage of the scholarship, and we always say in this field of studies, it can't be necessarily an exhaustive coverage of the literature, because it's simply nowadays impossible to say I've read everything. Unless you do a very specific technical thing, which the people in the medical field would know. If you do a systematic review on a specific clinical issue, then you have to read everything that's been published on that specific clinical problem. But normally in most fields of studies, if you don't do a systematic review, you do a literature search, you have to do it. You have to demonstrate that you understand where's the gap in knowledge and all of that. You can't be exhaustive, but you must be comprehensive in your coverage of the existing scholarship. If you don't do that, how would you know whether you make an original contribution? And then for a PhD, that differentiated from a master's is the challenge of theory or interpretation. The knowledge contribution must include an interpretation and a theoretical reflection, a theoretical contribution. You don't necessarily have to develop your new theory or a new model, but you have to theorize, and you have to locate your contribution in terms of a theoretical contribution. And what people have done, some of these studies that I will discuss today, they looked at how different people understand the notion of theory, what is it, and also they looked at examiners' reports. And the thing that examiners of PhD dissertations always ask for is, what is the contribution, and more specifically, what is the theoretical contribution? So there's no way of getting around that. There may be in certain very applied fields, they may sort of soften this requirement, but by far the majority of PhDs, the examiners would ask for the original contribution and the theoretical contribution. So let's discuss one or two of these things that we read in the literature. This Professor Wellington has been a professor in one of the UK universities for more than 30 years, very involved in managing, like Professor Rawlings, in managing the university system and understanding all of that. And he had all kinds of interviews, and based on that he said, what is the purpose of the doctorate? Now, this is a UK take on it. And that is sort of a good summary of I would say, the traditional understanding of what is the purpose of a doctorate. Notion of a doctorate has to do with process as well as product. And you can look at the different dimensions there. So you do a PhD, the purpose is to gain from the process first. The process leads to new scholars. You can teach. Many universities, that's a requirement. You have to have a doctorate before you can teach. Prepare for employment elsewhere, career development, skills, satisfy curiosity and intellectual interest. Many people see that as why they do a PhD, or just to prove yourself, which may be a motivation why people do it. And then, of course, the product, knowledge production. This doctorate as knowledge production, as well as doctorate as a pedagogical process in which capacity development and research development and personal development takes place. What could be the impact? It's still Professor Wellington arguing that if you have a PhD, you can change your work environment, you can get promotion and all of that, you can enhance your personal influence, you've developed your thought processes, you have more confidence in your own abilities, and you can make an impact through your discourse, through your participation in discourse. Now, this is in the field of social studies, this particular professor. So there are various ways in which you can think about the impact of the PhD. Then he discusses this thing of what is a contribution. And I think this is helpful to see that you can understand the notion of a contribution in different ways. It could be, traditionally, new knowledge. A new brick in the wall, the example that I used. That's the traditional one. It could be using original processes or approaches, new methods applying to an existing area of study. So there's the newness, the novelties in the processes. Creating a new synthesis of existing theories. So the newness is in the synthesis, not the theories. Exploring the implications for practitioners, that's getting closer to that idea of the professional PhD. Revisiting a current issue, offering new evidence. This one is more controversial. Do a replication study. I'm not so sure that I would be excited necessarily about somebody come to me and say, I want to simply do a replication and see whether earlier studies who did exactly that were correct. But there is a place for that, and more in scholarly work, with the increase in predatory publishing and in sort of the demise of good peer review and ethical problems in research, there is a place for replication studies. But for a PhD, I would be careful to accept that. And then presenting research in a novel way, that is again in the humanities a new way of writing. Somebody in music about 2 years ago did a very original way in which she presented the thesis and combined different things in a new way. So there are different possible understandings of contribution. But the thing that I think we should not lose sight of is the knowledge contribution speaks to theory and interpretation, and not only technical application stuff. We have to make a contribution in the world of scholarly work. And I have a new PhD student of myself here, and we had the discussion yesterday where I also tried to explain the thing. Quite often, PhD students, they experience a problem in the real world, in the everyday world. For example, there are criminals on the street, and I want to make a study to get the criminals off the streets. Then we have to tell that student that's perfectly noble thing to do, but that's not your job as a PhD student. That is the job of the police captain in town, who has the resources and the manpower and all of that to do that. Your job as PhD student is to understand why are there criminality? Are there links between criminality and poverty? And so on and so on and so on. So you need to understand, explain, theorize. You come up with models, you come up with explanations, and you can come up with recommendations. But you're not the one to implement. You're not the one to intervene. That is the job of the police captain. Another example, in business science, a colleague of mine recently said he had a student who came to him and say, I want to set up a beer factory. I'm in business, and I have a new way of doing things, and I want to set up a beer factory in Nigeria or somewhere else. And I want to write a business plan, and I want to do that for my PhD. And the professor said, no, that's not a PhD. That's a business plan, that's the intervention. You can go and do that there, but you're not going to get a PhD for that here. Because it's not necessarily a knowledge contribution. And again, there may be fields of study where this line between pure knowledge contribution, theoretical work, and application is more fluid and more porous than these examples. So that's why nationally people begin to think in terms of this professional doctorate. At Stellenbosch we don't have it yet. So here if you enroll here, I'm sorry colleagues, then you will have to come up with theory and theorize and interpretation. Otherwise, it's not a PhD that will be accepted here. Okay, moving on. Two other scholars who published quite a lot on doctoral studies, and they actually coined this notion of doctorateness. What is it? And I'll talk about both. The doctorateness as a concept, this combination of doing something and achieving something, the process and the product, and this notion of the threshold, something that you have to cross over. And there's a lot of theorizing around that. Now that's an illustration of the theory of supervision. So I have to practice what I preach. If I keep emphasizing theory, I have to dish up some theory here. All right? So these people, they work with the theory of the threshold concept. But before we come there, let's look at this idea of doctorateness. The key thing is there the notion of synergy. It's a kind of a jigsaw puzzle, and you must come up with a synergy where you have a network of different things, and I think it's nicely explained in this graph. It may be a surprise that not all doctoral students necessarily see this big picture of doctoral studies and realize that that is what you're going to do if you do a PhD. You have to attend to all these things. There are a range of dimensions, and you have to get a synergy between all of that. Okay, so there must be a gap, and you must identify the gap. And you must give good arguments that you've identified the gap. You can't just say, there's a gap here and there's no literature on it. You must prove. So you must give some evidence that this is indeed a gap in the knowledge. That's where you begin. And this is not necessarily always neatly a chronological process. It's a dynamic process. You move between them. But if you don't have some gap, some issue, some problem, you have a problem. You don't have a problem, and your problem is that you don't have a problem, and then you don't have a PhD. Based on the gap, a research question, and that's quite simple. That's a sentence which ends with a question mark, and you would be surprised how often we read doctoral proposals where it's not clear what is the research question. You read the whole thing and then don't know what is the question. So it's quite simple. Write a sentence and then add that thing at the end, and then you get to the point. A conceptual framework, you must think, how am I going to put this out? What will I do first, and what then, and what then? Explicit research design, and based on the design, decide on a methodology and how you will collect the data. That's sort of the detail of research methodology. So I'm working in the natural sciences. My design would typically be an experimental study, and based on the experimental study, it follows that I will use an appropriate methodology and collect my data and interpret my data in a particular way. Or in the social sciences, your design may be a survey or a case study, and following on that, there's a logic in terms of what methodology you would use. Then you have to present. Once you've done your analysis, you have to be able to write. And interesting, in the literature on doctoral studies, that is for many, many students one of the biggest hurdles. We think it's about the highfalutin, very complex theories or the work we do in the technical work. But people do that quite competently, and then when they get to the writing, they struggle. And there are many, many empirical studies that's been done amongst doctoral supervisors where they discover this struggle with writing. So that's something that we need to think about as doctoral students, but also as supervisors, how to help people to write. No, I don't want updates now. There's not a-
No. If you do that, it'll will go away when you click on it.
What, yeah, yeah, yeah.
There, it's gone.
It won't go away unless you say
Well, if you click the wrong button, we could have been sitting here watching the update.
don't worry.
All right, you have to write, and there's my story, the point that I'm making again and again. You have to develop an argument, which is sort of a coherent argument. You must answer the research questions. There must be conceptual conclusions and a contribution to knowledge. It looks like all common sense. It's not common sense. Many doctoral students don't see and don't understand that you have to do all of that. And that leads to the next concept, this notion of a threshold. So this whole thing, this whole big thing that with all the steps that you need to get through, it's like a threshold that you need to cross. So let's talk about this threshold idea. Candidates have to pass through that, and if they don't, it may impede their progress. They work in circles. If they don't understand the nature of doctorateness, they can't make progress, and there must be good collaboration. And passing through this threshold, it's underemphasized by supervisors and candidates and all of that. When I did my own doctorate, I had a very, very good supervisor, but we never had a discussion about what is the doctorate about and why do you do it, and what are the different things you're supposed to do. You have to sort of find your own way. You know, yeah, well, I have to read something, I have to go to the library, and I have to do stuff there, and then I have to write something, and that's about it, and get on with it. Huh? And only by doing it you discover all these things. Now, fortunately, that was many decades ago. Nowadays, universities and supervisors are much more aware that it's quite a big threshold to cross, and to understand what is going on in that threshold, to see this whole puzzle is helpful, and to not to get stuck in the threshold itself. So there you have the threshold is the doorstep, or the limen, in Latin, the limen. If you get stuck there, you will never enter the room where you're heading. You will still be here. But this experience of liminality, there's very interesting research around that, and briefly about, let me talk about this article. So the threshold is like a portal, opening up of a new way of thinking or doing. You transform, you interpret a new something that you haven't been there before, and a new way of viewing subject matter. An example there. I'm just a normal human. If I cross a bridge, I drive the car and I cross a bridge on a highway, it's just a bridge. My background is not in civil engineering. So it's a bridge, and there you go. If you're a civil engineer and you look at that same bridge, you see a different object. When I see the bridge, I see a rabbit. When the engineer sees the bridge, she sees a duck. Because she understands what's going on there. She understands the whole mechanics of the whole thing, and she can do all the sums to calculate all the different things going on if you build a bridge. So you look at the same object, but depending who you are, you see a different thing. So that who you are, you have to develop, you have to cross that threshold in that field. And then in anthropology, there was very interesting studies by Van Gennep 100 years ago about this rituals in humanity and in human communities. You go through these rituals to move into the next phase, from a teenager to become an adult. So you have to go through rituals. This rite of passage, you're between two worlds. You're still a teenager, but one part of you is sort of entering into the world of adulthood. And while you're there, there's a time of uncertainty, confusion, lack of confidence, this in-betweenness. That's the experience of liminality. And many, many doctoral students get stuck in that liminal state. And what do when you're in this middle, in between? You mimic. So you begin to do the things that your professors do. And you see them, they read books and they talk in this way and they use this language and they do these things in the lab. You mimic them, but still you oscillate between getting there and still being here. So this being stuck in the liminal state is very much part of the doctoral experience. And while you're stuck, you feel like the imposter. When one of my kids was small, I always told the stories of Kalikiter Kat, the little cat who actually didn't want to be a cat. He wanted to be an owl. So he tried to fool everyone. And we use this, explaining this notion of that. You're almost there, but you're not there. So you're feeling like an imposter. And maybe somebody like Professor Rawlings is no longer feeling he's an imposter, but I doubt that. I think if he's honest, even an A-rated researcher would say there are some days that I think, ooh, they're going to find me out. Now, if the A-rated people feel like that, how do we ordinary human beings feel? Someday, they're going to find me out. So this imposter syndrome is linked to you feel isolated, you think others think you can do it. And then you feel even more alone because you know really deep down, I'm not so sure I can do it. And you have this big challenge, you have to be original. And you don't necessarily have peers in your department, so you can be very isolated. And you're living with this big thing, I must make an original contribution. And then you have this, I'm not good enough. I'm feeling I'm a fraud. People will find me out, I suffer in silence. They may recognize that I don't belong in this program, and I invent a new identity for myself. I fake it. I make sure they never find me out. And there may be a research misalignment as part of this liminal experience. Now, the imposter syndrome, as I said, I think it's true of every person who's really honest. That there will be times where you have this uncertainty. Can I do this? And the original challenge is quite a big challenge. Will they not find me out? How can I fake it with integrity if that's possible? It's quite a battle. And you can't get stuck there. And then you get stuck on the doorstep in this never-ending state of liminality. You go around in circles all the time. How to deal with that? It may differ from person to person. There may be very supportive departments. There may be a very involved supervisor who help you with that. Or you may be very alone. And there are examples, even now, but more in the past, where it's up to you. The PhD is your problem. You must get through. And if you're stuck there, you must devise your own means of getting through. Nowadays, there are much more support, much more specific guidance to get people through this feelings of isolation and all of that. I think I'll stop here because that is, in addition to this notion of the big picture, this is the two concepts that I wanted to share in this lecture. So let me just summarize that and say, the doctoral study is to theorize, see the big picture, focus on a specific thing through which we study the big picture and theorize about it. Doctorateness is this notion of the synergy between all these dimensions. And to understand, you have to do all of that. And able to do all of that, or doing all of that, is crossing the threshold. And while you're in this threshold, you can feel isolated, you can feel you're stuck, and you can feel you're an imposter. And this has been well researched. It's the experience of so many PhD students, so you're not the only one feeling like that. And to get through that, talk about it. Talk about it with your supervisor, And just hang in there, work. That aha erlebnis, that moment of discovery will come. But you have to take effort, work, talk to colleagues, talk to your peers, and engage. Be actively busy with it. If you get stuck and you go in circles and you don't deal with it, you won't get out of it. It's not rocket science, but I think it's important to understand these things. Okay, we have some time for questions or discussions or comments or critique. Welcome. Anyone? Would you please put up your hands, those of you who have never felt that you're an imposter? Oh, I thought it was only me. Anyone, colleagues? Any comments? Yes.
I want to ask you a question about criminality, but in the context of interdisciplinarity, where the idea like doorstep like you was one doorstep, only one field, but in the interdisciplinary context, there are so many other doorsteps that you can cross. May I ask, given that our universities really are designed to have specific fields, whereas at times we're working in interdisciplinary fashion, how easy is it for a person doing interdisciplinary then cross the various thresholds of different fields?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I alluded briefly to that when I showed you the grand challenges. And then I said that those challenges, almost per definition, are interdisciplinary. So the complexity of the big issues that we deal with today are increasingly interdisciplinary. That's why people work more and more in teams. And it's interesting what you do then in that context with this threshold. So maybe we should say you need to cross a composite threshold, a number of them, but there must be some coherence. And talking about interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary, there are all kinds of conceptual distinctions to be made. There is that challenge that before you can really contribute in an interdisciplinary way, you need to be a specialist, at least in one field of study. Otherwise, if you're all over the place, you're not necessarily able to make a good contribution in an interdisciplinary field. So interdisciplinary doesn't mean superficial generalization. You still need specialization. And maybe one should think of the threshold then as a composite. There are a number of them, and there must be a coherence. But then when you try to get through that, you will go through all these experiences of that you feel alone, and it's even a bigger challenge. Not only to master your own field, but also sufficiently understand what the others in the team do so that you can contribute to the project. So don't shy away from interdisciplinary work because it's more challenging. I think the challenges that we deal with today require it. Other comments? Yes.
Okay, my question is also perhaps around originality. You spoke about theory, but you don't necessarily have to produce new theory, you said. So one has to engage with theory. And the other thing is, for me, I keep on hearing that your voice should come in a subtle way, but at the same time, I need to use theory, but I need to argue. So I get stuck in terms of how much would my voice come in? Should it be right at the end, or would it be a process along the way? Is there a weighted, kind of theory should be that much? And my voice,
stuff that's been out there in any case. So your own contribution, your own voice must be there. Even, and particularly in the literature, the way in which you review other voices, you have to do that. And then it comes to this notion of critique. Now, that would take us too far, but let me just mention it. You're not going to necessarily come up with an alternative for capitalism or Marxism in that sense, a new theory that will change the whole world. I think, well, many PhD students have that ambition, but I think realistically that's not going to happen. But still, there must be a theoretical contribution. And in order to make a theoretical contribution, you must be critical, you must critique what is out there. And there are two dimensions of critique, the transcendental critique or the immanental critique. And for that you need to come to me for a course in philosophy, which I don't know how to do that. So there are different understandings of the notion of critique. Critique doesn't mean that I'm a PhD and I simply read an article and I shoot it down. No. It's more sophisticated than that. But yes, you're right. Your own voice must be there. And your own voice is another way of saying that's your contribution, that's your take, that's your theorizing, that's your interpretation. There's no way of getting around that.
Thank you so much. I wish I could allow more questions, but unfortunately we have to prepare for the next session. Professor Botha, as always, I've learned a lot, and I know you've learned a lot. But I wish I could have you, we could have you for 2 hours, and I know that you will still have an audience that will listen with all their attention. Thank you for your time and your knowledge that you shared. And we can give him a big hand.
Thank you, colleagues, and good luck with your work.